I am the Assistant Director of Alumni Relations here at Bridgewater State University. And I'd like to welcome you to our November Aluminar, What Do You Value? The Trap of Consumerism, with Dr. Madhavi Venkatesan. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping items that we need to review. First and foremost, this Aluminar will be recorded. We ask participants to please keep their video off and stay on mute as to not distract from the presentation. In the top right corner, you will see an icon that is labeled View. We suggest the speaker view for an optimal watching experience. Questions can be typed into the chat feature in the bottom center of your lower toolbar at any time throughout the presentation. They will be collected and answered in the question and answer period at the end. As the presentation is being recorded, we will continue to answer all questions even if we passed the end time. The recording will be posted in the days following the Aluminar on the Alumni website, just in case you need to jump off before it ends. Okay. And with all that said, let me introduce you to our alumni host extraordinaire, Dr. Robert Bradley. Rob Bradley is research manager at the Deloitte Center for Financial Services, specializing in banking and capital markets research. Prior to joining Deloitte, Rob led research teams at State Street, primarily focused on investor behavior, macroeconomic analysis, and asset allocation, as well as operations and business analytics, and was founding member of the BSU employee network at State Street. He is also a faculty member at Boston College, where he teaches graduate courses on predictive analytics, communication, and leadership. Rob earned his bachelor's degree in economics from BSU class of 2012, as well as a master's in applied economics class of 2014 and a PhD in applied economics class of 2020 from Northeastern University. Rob lives in Plymouth with his wife and 3 sons. Take it away, Rob.
Thank you, Alexis. And it is so good to be back. I see some familiar faces here, lots of new folks joining us today, which is great. And yes, I live in Plymouth, and now it's getting into high time for Plymouth's most favorite time of year, with Thanksgiving coming. So we had a parade, we got pilgrims everywhere. It's very exciting around here. I'm also really excited for today's talk. As you can tell from my bio, I have an econ background, and we have an economist here today to talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm sure you're all going to enjoy hearing about as well. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. Madhavi Venkatesan earned her doctorate, master's, and bachelor's degrees in economics from Vanderbilt University, and has published 3 economics textbooks under the Series A framework for sustainable practices: Economic Principles, a Primer, Foundations of Microeconomics, and Foundations for Macroeconomics. She was an assistant professor with the Department of Economics and served as a consultant with the Center for Economic Education at Bridgewater State University. In 2016, Madhavi established Sustainable Practices, a 501c3 nonprofit with a mission to facilitate a culture of sustainability as defined by reducing the human-made impact to the planet and its ecosystems within Barnstable County, Massachusetts, and is the organization's executive director. In 2019, Sustainable Practices initiated the Municipal Plastic Bottle Ban campaign, and in spring 2020 facilitated the commercial single-use plastic water bottle ban. As of July 2021, the municipal ban has been adopted in all 15 towns that constitute Barnstable County, and the commercial ban had been adopted by town meeting vote in 10 towns and will be in effect in all 10 towns in 2021. The organization is continuing its efforts related to the commercial ban. Madhavi's academic interests include the integration of sustainability into the economics curriculum. She's been active in promoting education and stakeholder engagement to incorporate ethics into the existing economic framework, and her written work has largely focused on these topics as a catalyst to promote sustainability. So without further ado, Dr. Venkatesan, I will give you the floor.
Hi, thank you so much for that nice introduction. I look forward to speaking with all of you today and hopefully taking some of your questions. The purpose of my discussion, or the point that I'd like to make in my discussion, is specifically related to connecting the dots. So most people understand the primary issues that we're facing today as a human society in terms of the speed of climate change activity. But oftentimes there's a disconnect between our daily actions and how the issues that we seem to face and are so concerned with are only continuing to grow. And I'd like to point out some of the aspects of our economic system and what we do on a daily basis within that economic system, and also then hopefully share something that you can do to make a difference, not necessarily for yourself, but for the generations of people that come after you. So I'm just going to go into a very brief presentation, and then afterwards, and as we go, please feel free, if there are questions that you have, to share them, either in the chat or directly through a direct message, whichever is easiest or most convenient for you. So the title of this was meant to be a little catchy in terms of what do we value and the trap of consumerism. What I'd like to point out, and I'm pointing this out as an economist, but also the fact that economics is a social science, is that we are what we have been nurtured to be. I mean, part of it is what comes to us as a desire just to self-gratify, but self-gratification, to the extent that it exists in this society, has a lot more to do with the nurturing of that and the legitimizing of the desire, or the ability to desire and gratify oneself without taking into consideration any of the consequences of that gratification. So in some way, the title of What Do We Value in the Trap of Consumerism really ties to the very fact that if you really sit back and think about what it is that you value as a human being, more than likely it's not based on things. It's based on the qualitative responses that things may give you, or the relationships and qualitative attributes that you have with other people. But it's probably not a direct relationship to the inanimate object itself. And that's really important, because when we think about it, we spend more money on those inanimate objects than we do probably on fostering development of those qualitative attributes that we truly enjoy. So the consumerism component is one that's built into us based on the ease of access and the legitimacy of self-gratification. So there are a couple of things I'm just going to talk to you about, and then hopefully we'll work from there. So, you know, the basic aspect or premise of any discussion I give is that economic literacy is probably the core building block to success in terms of change, especially when you look at sustainability. But economic literacy, the lack thereof, is also one of the reasons why we have the issues that we do today. So these are two quotes, and I'm just going to bring up one aspect of both quotes. The first one is from Adam Smith, and a lot of people recognize Adam Smith as a father of economics, at least what we practice today, and to some extent, but they don't necessarily know what Adam Smith meant or was referring to in terms of how he looked at economic systems. At the basis of economics for Adam Smith is a sense of morality, embedded conscience in our decision making, which the way that we have actually implemented economic systems today is in direct opposition with that. We separate morality or conscience from the actions of most business enterprise, very much more so following that of Milton Friedman and the perception of the business is business, that fiduciary responsibility is only based on profit taking. But if you look at this quote from Adam Smith that I've placed here, what it basically says is to found a great empire for the sole purpose of raising up a people of customers may at first sight appear a project fit only for a nation of shopkeepers. It is, however, a project altogether unfit for a nation of shopkeepers, but extremely fit for a nation whose government is influenced by shopkeepers. So when we look at our economic system and the fact that we have been driven to consume, even when we don't even want anything, we still always have access and availability to buy some new marketed item to us, it really much aligns to this type of thought process. That it's not so much that these are satisfying our needs, but that we are being bombarded with the legitimacy of satisfying ourselves through just material wants. The other aspect here is it's really important, and this is why I think economic literacy is paramount to changing our system and making it one that's more sustainable and takes into consideration the adverse consequences of human impacts, is to look at this particular comment from the Minneapolis Fed, which is a nation's benefit from having an economically literate population because it improves the public's ability to comprehend and evaluate critical issues. This understanding is especially important in democracies that rely on the active support and involvement of its citizens. So arguably a democracy fits that example. So to the extent that we actually do not promote economic literacy and enable it, we probably see a lot of these disconnects between what we say we value and how we actually live our lives in accordance with what we value. So this is my comment. Economic literacy is necessary to understand the relationship we have adopted with the environment in order to be able to change that. Economics is a worldview. Economic systems do not have to be based on market values. They do not have to be based on maximizing individual gratification, based on material elements. They don't have to have externalized costs associated with them, such as pollution or habitat degradation. These are all elements of what we have been taught to value or include as part of our decision making. So the fault in our economic systems, to the extent that they cause these adverse consequences and increase poverty and enable discrimination and promote and heighten segregation, is related to the values that we as individuals have with regard to how we consume. So this is, I think, a very interesting slide just to think about and contemplate what is the purpose of an economy. And the first time, I talk to people just in my community, a lot of times people talk about economics as being about money, or economics is about making profit. But that's not what economics is about at all. Economics is really about well-being. It's about promoting gratification. And true economic systems, in terms of those that foster resilience and are sustainable, inherently have a cooperative component to them, because that means that people feel interconnected. And this is one of the issues when it comes to Adam Smith as well. When people talk about Adam Smith and they take the context of what he's writing off the table and just only focus on what he's stating, what they're neglecting to note is that Adam Smith was really relaying what he saw in interconnected, small, localized economies. When the butcher and the baker are each other's customers and live in the same community, the relationship between how they compete and what types of products they create is going to be much different than when they're multinational corporations that have no need to actually interact with one another. So there's a time and a place and context that matters. So that's why for a lot of people, when they think about cooperation, the first thing that goes to their mind is socialism. Well, no, it's not about socialism. It's about recognition that we are interconnected. And as I rise, I have the ability to help you rise too. As I fall, you have an ability to give me a hand so I don't fall so far. So a purpose of an economy actually that's not fear-based, which is what ours essentially is, promotes happiness through cooperation and enables well-being. So the operating system is our culture. And the reason why this is important to think about is, especially from a consumer component, is if you're in an operating system that's telling you have to consume, then your cultural predisposition towards consumption is going to be quite high. And why is that a problem? It's a problem because we do not have that much resource, especially as population growth increases at the rate we have in this globe, to continue to be consumer-based as a means of actually determining the value of our economic system. So this is important. And I just want to point out two things. We won't have time to talk about any of this, but if it's of interest to you, a couple of things to look at is how our religious systems were basically the basis of our economic systems at one time. So economics has not always been about production. It's been about other aspects in terms of how income is distributed, how people are taken care of, how the church is made rich while people are made poor. It's all dependent upon who the leader is. So an economic system is just any kind of human system that's determining how allocation of resources are made within that community. The word itself economics comes from managing the household. It's a Greek word referring to that. So it's how you value your household and the different entities within it that determines how you're going to manage it. So I think this is a good segue to the next step of what I'm going to talk about a little bit more, which is, this is a piece of art, modern art, and it's called Human Domination of the Earth. This is also where religion plays a tremendous role, even though we have a secular economic system. At the basis of it is still a perception of where man stands relative to the rest of all living and non-living things on this planet. The domination of a particular religious ideology can have a tremendous impact on this, especially if the perception is that humans are at the top of the trophic cascade and therefore have an inherent ability to dominate the rest of the planet. And not only do they have this inherent ability due to their dexterity, but they also have this given to them by a deity. So human dominance of the planet is something that's justified or legitimized through religion. Now, this is where the issue comes, depending upon what type of religious group you believe in or religious theology you have basically adopted for your own belief system. To have dominance, you need to, and to have it actually last, you need to have a stewardship mentality over those that you dominate. Otherwise, the dominance itself could exclude or preclude the long-term ability to have dominance, because you might eliminate everyone that you're dominating by not taking care of their individual needs. So that's an important part to take into consideration. So when we look at our planet and look at the way human societies have evolved and our economic systems have evolved, the question we have to understand or think about in terms of our consumption behavior and our consumerism and supposedly what we value is, how come in our taking dominance over this planet did we never think to ourselves that we also need to protect it in order to be able to maintain that dominance? So dominance in and of itself is not a blank check. It is one that actually incorporates and requires responsibility. So this is a simple example right here of a few items that we use on a daily basis that actually show very simply how we create products that don't take into consideration the need to protect the environment. So we've created plastics, and plastics are in cigarette butts. They do not biodegrade. They're used in our rain slippers, all these colored ones for children. They end up in the oceans where this shark or dolphin is being choked by one. We created products so that we can have single-use consumption, single-use disposal of waste, and they end up in the environment as well. So why is this tied to our economic system? Because in our value of looking for consumption, we don't take into consideration the end life and waste. So through the process of creating these consumer goods that actually drive our economy, because we're production-based, our GDP is based on how much we produce, we're not taking into consideration the adverse consequences of end of life, but we're only focusing on producing more and more, because that causes our GDP to increase. It causes our profitability to increase if we're an individual firm. Convenience-based single-use consumption is a perfect planned obsolescence product. You always have to have more. And when you're not taking into consideration the adverse consequences that come with disposable, and you're just dumping it in a hole in the ground or burning it, you're actually contributing to the undercutting of the future of life, because you can actually either have groundwater contamination heightened through burial of waste, or you can have contamination in airborne waste, pollution that affects people's longevity through breathing it in. 3 things that we need to live are air first, water second, and food last, in terms of just being able to keep ourselves going. And our consumption is not aligned to that at all. So that's important. And in speaking about this, we're going to go into my nonprofit work in 1 second. So hopefully that will be of some interest to you. So right now, over the last few months, we've seen an increase in people's understanding, given the different conditions that they've come into contact with because of the news, and also because of the information on climate change itself. And these right here are some polling outcomes that I would like to just share with you. And the reason why this is sort of important is the next slide. So if you look right here, people are getting more and more concerned across the board with regard to environmental issues. The interesting part is that the United States isn't at the highest grouping, that's Brazil, more in the middle line. But if I were to ask you which of these countries is perhaps the most responsible for the issues that we deal with today when it comes to packaging, which relates to the plastics, the materials that I shared with you, then excuse me, then you're probably going to be wondering which country should be at this list, end of this list, not Brazil. Well, let's see what that is. So sorry, my slide unfortunately isn't coming up right away. But the point is, what I wanted to bring up right here is that the United States is the single largest contributor to greenhouse gases on a global scale. Plastics were created in the United States, not elsewhere. The reason why we see heightened amount of plastics and other kinds of products that are non-biodegradable that are often found in other countries is because we've been exporting to them in order to be able to maintain our consumption domestically. So the purpose of education in terms of how we educate or speak to these issues is related directly to what is the outcome that we're trying to seek. And right now, the unfortunate thing in the United States is, given the fact that we have residential property tax dollars determining education, usually in most areas, especially for public education, we have a different set of parameters and also different political agendas attached to each community. That education could be tactical, political, cultural, obedience. It could be to actually foster critical engagement. The last portion of critical engagement is not something that education is actually used for very often, even at the collegiate level. So how does this tie into what I'm talking about? Well, if we were to educate people in terms of thinking in life cycle terms, at the point of production of a product, we'd already be thinking about the end life of that product. There are so many interesting documentaries as well as interesting readings that one could look at in terms of the 1950s and the determination of development of planned obsolescence for the sole purpose of financial growth, that it shows very clearly that there was an opportunity at the point of production to think about disposal, but it wasn't taken because disposal was so cheap, and all that really was the focus was producing more. What I mean by disposal being really cheap is land was in excess, so digging a hole and burying was very easy to do. So thinking in life cycles actually starts the change, whether it becomes on an individual level or on a much larger level, hopefully even a corporate level, with thinking about the products that are produced and sold in terms of corporate responsibility. But most people don't think about these things. So one thing I just like to point out to you, every step that you take away from the raw ingredient of a product becomes one where there are greater amounts of externalities or footprints, human footprints related to that product. So one of the biggest issues that we face is that most products that we have come at too cheap a price. And if it comes at too cheap a price, then the problem fundamentally means that we overconsume, which means we also have high disposal impacts as a result of that consumption. So the issue here is, why are we not pricing in all the adverse consequences that come out of the production? And that's quite simply because the way our economy operates is if there's no voice to actually voice the exploitation that's going on, that no one is considering it. So the two areas that are exploited the very most in order for us to have the cheap prices that we consume at are other people, impoverished people, and the environment itself, neither having a voice except for those that have more resources than them. So prices, as I've just noted, reflect the level of exploitation. What most people think about when they think about economics is that you have a supply and demand function and an equilibrium, where the equilibrium price is where the supply and demand come together. But the thing that they're not necessarily thinking about, not all instructors unfortunately talk about, is that prices really are reflective of who has the greater market strength, whether it be supply or demand. And so that's where the first step of exploitation occurs. After product is actually created, in the initial, excavation and natural resource stage exploitation that first occurs. And this means that prices if used and relied upon to actually be the value of something, can actually compound the adverse consequences of the consumption itself. Because you're going to continue to purchase things based on price without taking into consideration the true life cycle impact. So why have we gotten to this point? Arguably, on some level, this is on a much, much broader level, we are a very pro-business economy. We are focused on growing our GDP, which means that speed to market is something that everything in our economic system actually promotes. This also means that profitability metrics, things that on the individual firm level, are things that are enabled. That's why it's very hard to get products off the market, very litigious to do so, and very easy to get things on the market oftentimes. And also why we see so many issues related to toxicity being so suppressed, because profitability actually has a way of dominating information flow. So this is just an example of global GDP. And the thing that's important to remember here is that GDP, though it was a US-based metric, becomes an international metric around 1942. And so everyone is chasing it. But the thing that's also important to think about here, and I think is also shown in this particular graphic, is that not all countries are culturally focused on maximizing production. So this is one country's perception of what progress is producing and disposing, and producing and disposing. But other countries may have other bases for looking at well-being. But what you have fundamentally done when you've imposed a GDP indicator across all countries is you've basically forced them all to be production-based, leading to a cultural misalignment for some countries. Because the culture may not be based on valuing things based on the market, but valuing things based on their intrinsic value to the people in their communities. For a simple example, before I go into explaining this, there was a research study done once on giving blood. So people give blood because of all different reasons, but in this particular case, people were giving blood for free. And all of a sudden they decide, okay, why don't we compensate these people for their blood? We'll give them $30 for their blood. The number of people giving blood dropped. And the reason why is when they were giving blood, they thought that what they were giving had no price. It was priceless. They were giving the gift of life. By giving it a transactional value, they actually diminished the value of it being a gift of life. And it took away the desire to give. So though we've only thought of ourselves in a market system, because that's what we're forced to think about here, we don't necessarily probably critically engage with the fact that we sort of value things and people based on their market value, and that the market is imperfect in valuing people. What it also tells us is that there are other ways to value than just looking at how someone else or the market has chosen to value a product. And this is a truly American cultural construction. So I hope that that will be something to think about a little bit as you look at the holiday season and forward as well. Another misconception here, and there's another really great slide, but I don't have this one with me in this deck, but that points to how environmental resources are diminished in developing countries. Well, it's because they degrade their own, and then they go off to develop those so-called developing countries and take theirs. This is a perfect example of it right here. In the United States, we've been a very resource-intensive country. In order to be able to produce at the level we're producing, we have to have a lot of energy. In order to have that kind of energy, you've got to burn fuels, and we've been burning fossil fuels primarily. So the impact of the US on a cumulative basis has been exceedingly higher than that of the next country, in this particular case, China. And the reason why this is important is the half-life of carbon is anywhere between 500 to 1,000 years. So this means right here, especially when we think about the Paris Agreement, we're coming out of COP26, is that the US and US consumption rates, and that we have normalized in terms of our gratification and what we value and what we think we should have and we have a right to have, has far exceeded the impact of any other country on this planet. And on top of it, requires us as US citizens to take some amount of critical engagement with regard to why we're consuming and whether it makes any sense. So just one last graphic here. This is about ice coring data, Arctic ice coring data. And specifically here, what's being highlighted is that over the last 70 years, approximately the same amount of time that GDP has become the global metric for economic growth. And just as a correction here, it started off as a system of national income accounting, then was GNP, and then converted to GDP. But I'm using GDP synonymously with GNP. What you'll see is over the 70-year period, we have actually exceeded the greenhouse gas impact of preceding time periods. So this is what we're talking about when we're talking about the Paris Agreement and what we're trying to contain. But what I showed you in the earlier graphic makes very clear to you is that this is definitely a US-based issue, even though the finger pointing goes oftentimes elsewhere. It's a US consumer issue. The footprint on the planet is not based on sheer population numbers. It's based on population numbers relative to resource use, which is much higher in the US than many, many other countries. So these are another set of examples of single-use products. These planned obsolescence products that are bad and harmful to our health, and actually bad and harmful to the environment, are high resource products in terms of their production, and high life products in terms of their disposal, in the sense that they do not biodegrade, and if they are incinerated, they only lead to adverse conditions in terms of atmosphere as well as our breathing. So this is where I'm going to segue to what I have done with this type of thought process. So I lived on Cape Cod. I still live on Cape Cod, but not as full-time. We started a commercial single-use plastic bottle ban with my nonprofit, Sustainable Practices. That bottle ban basically did what I shared with you. It looked at the extraction to production, consumption, disposal elements of plastic, whether that plastic be plant-based or petroleum-based. So we wanted to explain to people that recycling is not a solution and why. And also explain why the idea of recycling doesn't make any sense, because you're always going to have to create more plastic in order to be able to provide that single-use consumption item. High resource impact, whether it's through growing or through using. And the issue is, even if for that very small percentage that gets recycled, it can only get recycled at the very most twice. But even in the recycling stage of plastic, it really needs to be rebonded to virgin plastic. So you constantly have to make it. It is typically downcycled, which means, again, that you need more plastic to make this one product here. And the downcycled plastic will eventually be wasted. So it'll be in your clothing fibers. That's why we have so much more clothing. It's spandex and elastane. It's because it's so available. And we also have it in our decking, our construction materials, so many other places. Plastic is not safe for human consumption in the sense that it does have leachate that goes into the beverage or the food substance, especially the food substance being more fatty and you put it in the microwave, you have a higher probability of taking in that leachate. Estimates are that humans consume right now about a credit card's worth of plastic a week. We definitely are breathing it in, and there's evidence now that plastic is moving across the human placenta into the child. So babies are born with plastic in their system. So the article that we passed we passed it in 11 towns. We did have a rescind this last Monday in Sandwich, so it's active in 10, and we will go back and refile in Sandwich, but we are also filing in a few other towns, or a total of 15. 15 towns have adopted a municipal ban on single-use plastic, and this commercial ban eliminates the retail sale of single-use plastic water bottles. This tells you the language right here, and eliminates the sale with an emergency provision. The most important thing to consider, though, here, and this is the education component, is that municipal water is regulated much more highly than bottled water. So this gives us a perfect example of how we've been marketed to consume a product, a single-use convenience product with a very high footprint at a very, very low price, which very simply shows the power of a market to exploit the environment to keep the price so low. That doesn't factor in pollution at production and pollution at waste, or the leachate at consumption, which is directly tied to ADHD, obesity, endocrine disruption, fertility diseases, as well as cardiovascular disease. And so we have this enforcement vehicle there as well. And this perhaps just gives a summary right now of where we stand. And what we're focused on, and how I'm also focused in terms of this issue about consumption, is that this is not a government issue, it's not a business issue, it is an individual issue. Because each one of us as individuals is a consumer, we are a member of the government, and to the extent that we own any mutual funds, have any kind of investments, we're also investors. It is up to us to engage in critical thinking of the world that we've inherited, to understand the framework that we operate under, to understand how our purchase decisions affect things and have a tremendous ripple effect. Does everybody have the same ability to make and affect change? Perhaps not. But that should not be the basis for precluding our responsibility to at least investigate how we can. Why is it important on an individual basis, on a more micro basis than looking at a macro one? This is very simple. People who are in elected office want to stay in elected office. Those people who are looking to get elected want to basically get public opinion that aligns to whatever they're going to speak at a podium. So they're not going to go out on a limb unless the society itself, which is comprised of us individuals, has also actually engaged and thought critically and educated ourselves with regard to the issues and started to take back the control so that we can have people who represent us in government that are actually promoting the best interests of our society and the environment. And also that we can ensure that corporations start to think about what consumers value. In order to do this, we have to take back that responsibility that we've allowed to be broken free of the general citizen or resident over intergenerational time. How many people, even on this Zoom call, have gone to a town meeting? Or how many of you know how often people in your communities go to a town meeting in Massachusetts? Typically, it's less than 1% of usually most people for most towns. It tells you a whole lot in terms of the involvement that people take in their own governance. And that's hopefully something that this little presentation heightens. The only way to really change the system that we're in today is to do it from an individual basis, and then creating a collective where everyone works together to try to establish a different worldview than one that's purely based on gratification. So with that, I'll say thank you, and I'll be happy to take any questions you have.
Thank you so much for that presentation. This is eye-opening, might be the word I'm looking for, but I really like the flow into the end, because this is one of the things I was going to ask about was the responsibility of each individual. And I think this is something that people kind of get caught up on, and it's understandable, I think, but looking and saying there's so much work to do, what use is me doing anything, or what, how much impact can I have? And so I like that the first step is to figure that out, right? Is to try to find where you can affect change, not try to affect all of the change, right? And I genuinely think that is terrific advice in a lot of different ways. Also, just I think talking about economics as our economic system as a cultural system, not just a foregone conclusion, this is just how things work, this is how it's going to be, is also brings it to the individual too, right? If you change your behavior and suddenly you're not, just buying into or going along with the way the system flows or expects you to, it will change the economic system. You'll have something different, because you're absolutely right that there isn't just one system. There is kind of a continuum of types of ways to interact with people and products and things like that. So thank you. I think there's a lot of really terrific stuff here. I'm going to start. So we have a question from the audience, and they're asking, what is Canada doing so right? And I guess the next question is, are they doing things much more right than us? And why is the US so reluctant to adopt sustainability, particularly things that we know actually work well elsewhere?
Well, I'm not so sure that Canada is doing anything right. I'm not 100% sure about what that question is referencing, but I can speak to the U.S. situation. I really think it unfortunately has a lot to do with an educational system that gives freedom as a right to individuals without any understanding of the exercise of freedom being a responsibility. And so from that perspective, I think what we have is unfortunately, Canada's now I see your question. Canada's a much smaller economy than the United States. So I would imagine that the amount of greenhouse gas emissions have a lot to do with that. It could also have a lot to do with their energy mix, and that may be what's captured in the amount of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions. But fundamentally, what that graphic is showing is that the U.S. from 1875 to 2021 has had a higher rate of greenhouse gas emissions than any other country in the world. And because it's a cumulative impact, that means over time it will still have a higher impact than other countries, given that the 500 to 1,000 year half-life. So, but in terms of the US, I think the bigger issue is that unfortunately, and this came about with the plastic bottle ban itself, is that people don't necessarily recognize their responsibility. They've really bought into the idea that they have a right to consume whatever they want to, whenever they want to, and it doesn't really matter what impact it has on anyone else. And on top of it, they don't necessarily see an extended responsibility to the communities where that resource or that particular product is being made. When we talk about plastics, we're talking about small communities like the communities that are making up Cape Cod, where the people are marginalized because it's right around what we call Cancer Alley in the United States. So of all the people in the country that perhaps need assistance, it's the most vulnerable. So what does this say about us in terms of our intrinsic morality or conscience that guides our own purchasing decisions when we continue to foster the development and production of products that are going to harm some people as long as it's not us? So we see this is actually a very strong parallel to that NIMBY attitude, not in my backyard. It shouldn't be not in anyone's backyard, right? The problem is that fundamentally we do not see ourselves, unfortunately, as a nation of people. We see ourselves as a nation of me. And I would say this is where leadership could actually play a strong role, is to try to create some sort of cohesion, at least along some sort of value lines that makes us all uniformly feel as though we're American and equally so. There are a whole lot of things you could say about all of this too. I teach a class called Economics of Race. There's a long way to go with regard to creating a cohesive national policy when it comes to the citizens of this country.
I wish I was still in school. I would take that class in a heartbeat. That's fascinating. And you can, as you said, there's a million ways where you can show, however you want to put it, show that there's a totally different experience for people in this country, depending on where you live, who you are, generationally, kind of where you land, that type of thing. And the evidence is very clear on it. It's one of the places where research is very consistent in terms of showing that, yes, there are actual disparities. You can predict them, you can see them, that type of thing. And I think in terms of this cut of that issue, looking at it from a sustainability perspective, the idea of not in my backyard, when, okay, so what is your response if you can't control what lands in your backyard? So for these marginalized communities, sure, somebody else is going not in my backyard, but then where does it go? Who does it affect? And if you don't feel like you have some responsibility for that, for other human beings, for people who then don't have that sort of power to affect change or respond on an individual level, then you're totally right. They're taking their freedom as a right and shirking their responsibility, which is absolutely something that people like to leave out when they're talking about their right to do things, is they don't want to talk about the other side of that. So that's fantastic. Somebody, same person actually also brought up the pandemic itself, and the point here was about during the pandemic, lots of people are staying home, so you're getting takeout. There's maybe changing your consumption pattern a bit. So you're ordering food when maybe before you would have gone to the store, stocked up, and then not had to drive and all these things. So I'm curious if you have a sense, because there's been a lot of things revealed through the pandemic in terms of, you can see pollution levels change as consumption changed, the interruption of supply chains, which has this kind of broad effect. It also affects people differently. So maybe if you could comment a bit on either your thoughts or expectations or something that you've noticed that might have been exacerbated or helped from the pandemic, right?
Yeah, the slowing of human activity on the planet definitely benefited the environment, and also benefited other species, because you could see very clearly that when there's no human around, that they're more desirous to come out and walk around and partake in the world that they're a part of. But when it comes to single-use products, the pandemic actually heightened their use, and most single-use products unfortunately still are very plastic. The issue that brings up for me is that if I have a reusable bottle and I take it home and I wash it, I know how clean it is because I washed it. When you go to a store and you're buying single-use plastic, I don't think people think about how dirty the outside of that container is, but that's going to contaminate your hand. Plastic actually is known to, the virus can live on plastic, so it's not like it's somehow cleaner. This actually ties very clearly to the idea that we're marketed to consume, that we believe, that we have just embraced whatever we've been told, that that bottle of water that's not regulated, that we don't know what the contents of, is somehow safer that we purchase in in a store than the amount of water that we could drink from our own tap. So the unfortunate thing is the COVID situation just only was heightened by fear, just like everything else. And it actually helped exacerbate a fear-based economy to go into overdrive when it comes to disposal. So there's an active trade-off between long-term well-being and short-term perception of well-being. And I think unfortunate that happened. And the industries, the plastics industry, the beverage industry, and other industries that are directly related to plastic containers are benefiting from fear.
That's really interesting. It's funny. I mean, I was talking to my wife about this the other day, that at the beginning of the pandemic, we were especially very careful and everything, I'm sure, like a lot of people. And that's one of the things we were talking about, is it makes you think for a second, because you get takeout and suddenly you're like, well, who has touched this? Where did they touch this? All these different things. And it's just from a general cleanliness level. It's like, I never thought about it. I just, for some reason felt it would be fine. So you're totally right. The other there, I just had another question. It's escaped me, so it'll come back, I'm sure. One of the things too that you mentioned, or you brought up, is this refuse, reduce, reuse slogan, I guess you would call it, because we all know the reduce, reuse, recycle slogan. It's something my kids are being taught actively everywhere they go, which is nice. I mean, it's nice that it is very, very pervasive from a very young age, that to think about the things you're consuming. They do talk about it in school and stuff, but I've never seen it put quite this way, because I like this refuse as the first step, because it does then put the onus back on you to say, like, well, let's look and see what else there is. I can put the effort into a bottle. So that's part of your sustainable practices campaign? And I guess my question is, did you come up with that, or did you find it somewhere? And how have people kind of reacted to that?
We did come up with that, but I don't think it's that novel. I think
it's great.
But it's typically, I think a lot of places do have, like, my town has a 9 R's, but different people have different R's. But the bottom line is recycling doesn't work.
Yeah.
And recycling is a false salve to a much, much bigger problem. And the unfortunate part of it too is that people think they use the word recycling synonymously to dropping the product in the blue bin. Putting something in a bin or a container that's meant to be recycled doesn't mean that it's actually going to be recycled. And this is the sad part, because most Americans are not even aware of where the plastic waste goes, and they have a false perception of its value. And right now, the commodity value of plastic is increasing slightly, and the primary reason is because companies like Coca-Cola and Nestle are trying to greenwash by saying they're going to have a portion of their product that will have recycled plastic in it. Because increasing the cost of using that is worth a little bit slice of their profitability, as opposed to the complete elimination of it if they have to substitute for a different type of container. Plastic water bottles represent 60% of the beverage market, so that's why they're trying to do this now. But the issue here is getting people to start understanding what can be recycled and how often it can be recycled. So plastic, maybe 1 or 2 times tops. Paper, 2 or 3 times tops. And most everything else, not really that much at all.
The other thing too, this is something I just learned, I think like a year ago at my last employer. They had a day where they had people standing next to the recycling bins, and they would, as people come, say, you can't recycle that because it's dirty. Like, if you have food on your container, it will not be recycled. It will just be thrown out. And so they were like, here's what you need to do. You need to go wash this out. And so it added steps, but it was every person who went up was like, I had no idea. I had no idea. Never would have thought of it. So there's so many things that get recycled, and you're right. they just get put into a landfill because they can't be sorted, that type of thing.
And if they're placed in with other clean recycling, they contaminate the entire
Exactly.
recycling. Pizza boxes cannot be recycled. People think they can because they're made of cardboard, but they can't because they have food waste on top of them. This is why thinking about the production to disposal component at the point of the initiation of a product is so important, because if you're held responsible and accountable, then you're going to design products that are not going to have those adverse conditions attached to them. But
I love that. And so we're up against time. I know you have to run to class now. So I just want to say thank you so much for this. This was incredibly informative, both eye-opening and encouraging, which is a difficult balance to strike. And I wish we could just talk about this all day long, because honestly, I would just keep going on this. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate it.
no, thank you so much too. I hope that others also hopefully got something out of it, maybe they change their Christmas buying habits. Thank you.
And I would just like to thank you both, Rob, for effortlessly facilitating questions and answers as always. And, you know, what a great presentation that we had today. So thank you both. As most of you know, we have moved to a bi-monthly format. So our next Aluminar will actually be held on January 12th. And it's entitled Lose Fat, Build Muscle, and Still Enjoy Life with Carl Holland, class of 2015. And registration for that event will open in the next few weeks. And we, of course, as always, encourage feedback and suggestions on Aluminar topics. So please feel free to reach out to us at alumni@bridgew.edu, and also visit our website, bridgew.edu/alumni. That has changed. If anybody has visited our old site, it's bridgew.edu/alumni these days for all of our alumni updates and information. And on behalf of the entire alumni team, I wish everyone who was with us today the happiest of holidays, and we will see you all for our next Aluminar in January. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks, everybody.